Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, this is Gabe Lyons. Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. And today is one of the episodes we love to do each month, which is our book tour. And today we're interviewing Diane Langberg. She is the author of Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. It's a deep topic, an important topic, a subject that we talked about at this past year's Culture Summit with Rachel Denhollander. And we want to press into that today by interviewing Diane about this book, about the subject of power, how power is misused, not just in the world, but how it's been misused in the church. And what are we to do about that? And I think you're going to appreciate her thoughts and her answers to some of these questions. But I also want to invite you that you get the chance to ask Diane your questions. She's a foremost expert, as you're going to see, on trauma, and over the last 50 years has studied that and what that means to us individually, to our psyche, to how we operate within systems, within cultures, within the things that we're called to lead. And so what an incredible opportunity on Wednesday for you to get the chance to ask your questions to her live during our Q&A for our book tour. And you can learn more about that at qideas.org/book tour. But as you're listening to this, think about questions you might have for someone from Diane's background that understands this topic and has had such great experience in it. But also when you go to qideas.org/book tour, you can see a 9-minute talk that she delivers just for us, for this community, to better understand how this power and this abuse of power is showing up. But most importantly, how do we redeem it? What are we to do about power and authority? What is the right ways in which we live a redemptive leadership role? Where God rightly shows us how power and authority should show up in the world, and how do we demonstrate that today? So let's listen now to my conversation with Diane Langberg. Well, Diane, welcome to the Q Ideas podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Gabe. It's good to be here.
I know it's been almost a decade, not quite, since you delivered a wonderful talk at our Q Ideas event in Washington, D.C. that people still talk about, dealing with trauma and helping this community of leaders really understand that word. And it was a word that I would say 10 years ago was not being used as much as it's become very much a part of the vernacular today as people think through psychology, mental health, processing their stories. What was it for you that ultimately brought you into this place where trauma and healing became so central to your life mission?
Well, I started out with a master's degree in 1972 and was working on my doctorate. And there were not very many females in the field. And so a lot of women would ask to speak with me once I started doing some counseling. I was also working with Vietnam vets at that time. And at some point realized that the women and the Vietnam vets had the same symptoms and concluded that there was more than one war zone in the world. And the women were telling me things which were about rape and sexual abuse and domestic violence, terms that were not used. And I was told that they were hysterical and I shouldn't believe them. Mm. So the supervisor who told me that I quit listening to and told them I didn't know anything and I needed to learn from them. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't even a diagnostic category till 1980. So this was 8 years prior to that time. But you know, the stories broke my heart. And I told them I didn't know anything and that they would have to teach me before I could figure out what might help them.
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, you're 50 years into this journey.
I am.
Of learning, of listening. And I think because of all of that, you've brought such wisdom and a depth to this conversation as it's now emerged to be such a dominant and important conversation the world is having, and now in your latest book, you're really helping apply this to spiritual communities, to the church. Your book, Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church, takes a hard look at these spiritual communities that are created that also can lead to abuse. And, you know, for so long, people thought, well, that's not possible. That's just a rumor. That's people just trying to put down the church. But obviously what's become clear in the last couple of decades is that this type of abuse has been rampant for a long time, right?
Oh, it has. And I knew that, but I knew it behind closed doors and couldn't say so very much. Just, for ethical reasons, obviously.
Yeah, so you've been watching this story kind of emerge and become more public and become something that the world is now talking about. And it began with, I would say, the Me Too movement obviously brought this conversation up about abuse of power and
Yes.
how that began to become something people were just more aware of and able to start to recognize. What did it feel like for you, just kind of having known this was taking place and then starting to see exposure of it?
Well, sadly, I was glad to see that because I know that without truth and light, there will be no change. I mean, it breaks my heart, number one, that it happens at all. And I've been working with individuals who broke my heart for years. Having the church or Christian organizations, whatever, exposed is another way to break a heart. But again, I was glad because if we do not acknowledge the truth of the wrongdoing in our midst, often done in the name of God, and certainly covered up for his name's sake, we have cancer. We're dying.
Yeah.
And I was glad to see the cancer named.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, for many people, religion and these spiritual communities become a place where, like you said, there's cover up of this thing happening because there's a fear it's going to hurt people's perception of God or it's going to change their faith. But as you've been in this space for so long, when the truth is exposed, what are the positives that come from this kind of information coming out? Because we know the negatives and we know all the perception challenges that might come with that, but you've seen the side of healing and give people vision for why it's important that we expose these things.
Well, I would first take them back to our Lord, who went into the sanctuary of his day and cracked whips and turned tables over. And he said, "You've made my Father's house a den of robbers," which literally means a safe place for those who steal. And so we also have done the same thing with our Father's house. We have made it a safe place for those who steal from the vulnerable. And when he did that, it was an invitation. Come, step into the light, see, learn, change. They did not, even though he did it twice. This is the same thing. This is God's invitation to his people who name his name, but don't act like him, to step into the light and find healing and truth and a likeness to him that's not there while this is going on.
Right. And in the title of your book, you talk about redeeming power. And so many times power in this current moment can seem to just be a completely negative word. That anybody that has power should be maybe looked at skeptically, should be looked down upon, or should be questioned, or we should have a skepticism towards. But you talk about the role of power and how it can be used for good. But would you help just define that term for people that maybe need to hear, like, what is your take on power? What is power? What is authority? Jesus clearly exhibited that and carried those attributes well, so there's a redemptive side to it. But help us maybe with that term today, as it's a moment where it seems to be a bit confused.
Well, I would take us first back to the beginning. When the God of all power created us, he made us in his image and sent Adam and Eve out to rule and subdue the earth. Those are power words. Not each other, not people, but his earth. And so part of what we have to reclaim is the fact that the power that we have is God-given. Now we have to figure out how to use it in a way that truly honors him and bears his character, which we have sadly not done.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think when you think of it biblically, obviously this idea of subduing, taking dominion, not over people, but over the resources or over the ways in which our world operates is important. It's important to calling. And we've seen, good examples of that, but I'm curious from your perspective, what would be healthy examples of authority today? Are there particular attributes that you would say are important for any leader who's listening to this? Because that's a large part of our community would be leaders, people who've been given stewardship over companies, organizations, or creating art or institutions, what are some of the attributes that a person in leadership needs to make sure are part of their life, their culture, the way in which they operate that help safeguard them from abusing power?
Well, the first thing that I would say, which is a negative thing, not a positive, but that is that we need to recognize that power that is redemptive is not found in the externals. I do not have power in a godly way if I measure myself by the size of my organization, the number of people in it, the fame that I have, the this and the that. When I start measuring power in those ways and put God's name on it, which is what we've done. This person has all of these things that are successes and they work for God, and so it's all good. And there's no examination of the self or the institution. And so we have, unfortunately, allowed power to bear God's name that looks nothing like him. But true power that is in the image of God means it is used to honor him. It looks like him. It bears his stamp. It's his character in someone. So it's not the externals produced. You can have somebody with a church of 5 people in a corner of the earth nobody's ever heard of, who has tremendous power in a godly way, but who in the world's measure has nothing, absolutely nothing. And it's the likeness to him that is the most power. And it is the likeness to him that got ruined in the garden.
Yeah, and you talk about cultures that can be created around these false views of power, and I love how you're describing how much we tend to take on man's measurement of success or fruit. I mean, you'll hear people use that term a lot in Christian communities, like the fruit of their work is so obvious. God clearly is working, even though there might be these character flaws or this abuse of power going on or desire to use that to build themselves up, maybe not God. What would you say are some of the antidotes to that kind of power, and how to continue to create spaces and organizations that help a person that's been given that kind of leadership or stewardship stay accountable?
Well, we have lost the art that many of the monks through history talked about, which is self-examination. We've certainly lost I think in many ways, the humility that asks others what it's like to be around us. Jesus talked constantly about, I only do what pleases the Father. And he also made it very clear that a likeness to the Father and a good use of power bears the characteristics of that Father. It isn't in outcome. If it's outcome, he didn't do a very good job. So many years ago, I was speaking in Brazil about trauma, and a young pastor came up to see me at the end with a question. And he said, I live in a very small village, and all of the men in my village are alcoholics. All of the men in my village beat their wives. All of the men, no exception, including the judges and lawyers and everything else, abuse their daughters. Please, Diane, can you tell me how to help my people? Which I stood quiet for a while, trying to figure out what in the world to say to a question like that. But what I realized then, which is what we're talking about now, and I said to him is, you love your wife, you protect your children. You know, you are not doing these things. You are the first time they have seen that. They did it, their fathers did it, their grandfathers did it, whatever. What you're doing is bringing the light of Christ into that world by the way you live with your family and other people. You incarnate what is good and true and right. That's what a good leader does. It's always incarnational. It's not external results. So it's manifesting, making real in the flesh who Jesus was and what his character was like.
You write about in your book, in the section you have called Power Abused, you talk about power in human systems. And I know there's been much discussion over the last year about systemic injustice. And there's been a debate even in the church of how much of this is systems, how much of it is just one bad apple corrupting a system. can injustice be built into systems? And would you just describe a little bit about, as you wrote about this abuse of power in systems, help people understand more what you found and what you believe to be going on in that abuse?
Well, the meaning of the word system is together stand. And so part of what happens with systems is they are people who have come together thinking they are of like mind and like goals, and they want to have the gospel preached, and they want all kinds, they want to send missionaries, whatever. They want to do all those kinds of things. And in doing so, those goals become primary rather than character. And what happens is, so you have somebody at the top saying, I can do this for you. Listen to me, we do these things, whatever. And they need the leader to make that happen. And so they follow the leader no matter what kind of character he or she has. And then usually in a system, there's a somewhat small special group that works with the leader and protects him from criticism, from all of those things, holds him up, helps him achieve the goals that he has and the church now has. And what happens when somebody comes forward in a system like that is that everybody at the top works together to silence the person who will do, they think, harm to the system. And so we have to protect that system no matter the cost. And people say things like, don't you see what God is doing here? Just like you said a little bit ago. Don't you see how many people are coming to the church? Don't you see how many people we're doing this and that for? Which is no measure of Christ-likeness.
Right. Yeah. So as you've been in this journey, certainly walking alongside so many different survivors that have been subject to this kind of an abuse, what have you seen the fruit be when a leader who's abused power is exposed, and despite what those who were trying to protect the system wanted to happen, which was to protect it because they felt like it was going to harm the quote unquote ministry or the work that God was doing there. Once it's been exposed, what is the fruit on the other side of that? How have you seen God redeem that?
Well, number one, for the victims, it is extremely redemptive. Their voice has been heard. Their voice has been seen as true. Their damage is seen. It gives them hope. It can often renew a lost faith in God, because when a system abandons a victim, they feel like God went with them. Mm. He's not there for them. And so it's very restorative on the, quote, lesser levels. Mm. It's also a call to all Christians when something like that happens, or when we read about it in the news or whatever. It's a call to us to examine ourselves and our systems. You know, this is not something that only happened to this huge place with this particular person, but it certainly isn't happening with us. We need to say, where are we? Where are we with these things? Where are we hiding things? First from ourselves, or in our own families, and then in our larger systems like the church or an organization. We hide the things to preserve what we call good. Hmm. So it's a tremendously healing thing when churches are exposed, or huge groups are exposed, or even for that matter, one perpetrator is exposed. Truth sets people free. It's an invitation to the abuser to look at him or herself. It's an invitation to all of us to be reminded of who God is and his character and what he's called us to be like. Mm. You know, I said that systems mean together stand. The word dissident means to sit apart. And that's what Jesus was. He was a dissident. Mm. And he did it with grace and love and truth and all of those. He didn't do it with hate or screaming or anything else, mm-hmm. which is what we tend to do. Mm-hmm. But he was a dissident, and he's called his people to be dissidents when it comes to things that look nothing like Christ, in the same way that he was a dissident.
Mm, that's great. You talk about in this book how the church is meant to be a sanctuary for the vulnerable, but the opposite has happened. It's become a sanctuary for the powerful. What is your vision as you look at a healthy church, as you look at the years ahead, as to how we start to right this ship and how you can imagine the church maybe becoming back to this place where it's a sanctuary for the vulnerable versus one for the powerful?
Well, I think, which I think is very true to the scriptures, the first response needs to fall on our faces, Gabe. There are ways that all of us have ignored things because that's what we do. We deceive ourselves that something's okay that's not okay. Sometimes in our own life or our own family, sometimes in larger systems. So I think we have to start there and ask God, as the psalmist did, search me, expose me to myself, and then lead me into a new place. Judas in the New Testament is in many ways a very interesting character because one of the things it says in the Gospels is that Judas was a thief, but he had the bag. And I spent a good number of years trying to figure out why in the world Jesus would give him the money bag if he knew he was a thief, which he obviously did know, until I realized it was an invitation to repentance. He, in front of the Lord himself, he stole money from that bag and did it so well that none of the disciples knew. And Jesus kept letting him have the bag in hopes that he would see what he was doing and fall down on his face.
Yeah, so Jesus, even in our circumstances or maybe in our communities around us, is constantly there trying to confront us or sharpen us or invite us into confession and vulnerability, right?
Yes, he is. And he wants to turn the light on. He doesn't ask us to examine ourselves as a solo. He says, do it with a duet, as a duet with him. And he's the God of all love.
Yeah. Diane, just shifting into current issues and kind of where we sit today in a world that seems to be having experienced a lot of trauma, even many talk about this pandemic has created for some a high degree of trauma, big trauma, but there's also been this low level hum of just change and drama, the trauma that has come with losing a job or friendship or relationship or so many other areas of agency that have maybe changed quite a bit in the last couple of years.
Yes.
What is the opportunity that's presented when we're walking through something like this individually or communally that we could see the hopeful side of what God might be doing in the midst of this?
Well, I think throughout the scriptures and things, when we see things like that, it's God calling his people, both individually and collectively, again, to examine themselves and to come to him to be redemptive in their lives. We seem in our society, certainly now, we keep talking about them, they this, they that. We're not looking at ourselves. And we're not looking at ourselves in terms of our characters, not our gifts, not our externals, but our kindness, our patience, our faithfulness, our self-control. And obviously that means change comes from the inside out, and it comes one by one. But one by one, it becomes a body, and a body that loves and follows Jesus Christ. But we have to start with ourselves, both personally, but also in terms of what we are doing, thinking, believing about leadership, and whether or not we're actually thinking the way he thinks.
Yeah, that's good. It's good wisdom. And I'm so grateful, Diane, for your faithfulness in this subject. I know 50 years ago, it had to have felt like you were just completely alone. Nobody was caring about the issues that you were getting exposed to. And I'm sure that led to a lot of dark nights and moments for you. But I'm just praising God for your faithfulness to continue to press into this, to allow us to have this just wealth of wisdom over many, many years that you've collected that help all of us move forward with the right understanding of what God might be trying to do in this moment. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. This interview, again, it's part of our Q Ideas book tour series, where each month we select a book for the Q Ideas community to read through together, to listen to these conversations and interviews, and to give you the chance to ask your own questions to these authors, to these experts around topics that are so important to all of us. And so I want to invite you to go to qideas.org/book tour, where you can watch Diane's 9-minute talk just for you, and then also to submit your questions, which you can do on that page as well, so that you can ask her exactly what you're wondering about this particular topic. And then I'll be hosting and facilitating that on Wednesday, November 17th at 1:30 Central Time. I hope you'll join us at qideas.org/book tour, where we'll talk more about her book, Redeeming Power.